welcome to the Center for Global Humanities. My name is Anouar Majid. I'm the director of the Center for Global Humanities. We are delighted today to be hosting Ed Berenson on the subject of the Statue of Liberty, a fascinating topic, especially in our times. And Ed is a professor of history at NYU and director of NYU's Institute of French Studies. He's also senior fellow at the National September 11 Memorial and Museum. Berenson is a cultural historian specializing in the history of modern France and its empire, with additional interest in the history of Britain, the British Empire, and the United States. He's the author or editor of 7 books, and he's currently at work on a book entitled Blood Libel in an American Town, Messina, right, and New York, 1928, which examines the lone case of a ritual murder accusation against American Jews. In 1999, Berenson received the American Historical Association's Eugene Asher Distinguished Teaching Award, having earlier won UCLA's Distinguished Teaching Award. In 2006, French President Jacques Chirac decorated him as Knight in the Order of Merit. Please help me welcome Ed to the podium.
Thank you, Anouar, for that generous introduction and for inviting me. Welcome. I'm so thrilled to be here and glad you're all around. And it's always just an incredible pleasure for me to talk about a subject that's so dear to my heart. I'm not accustomed to standing in one place at the podium, and so if I start to stray, Anouar promised to rein me in. So before we get going, I'm just curious about what you think when the Statue of Liberty is mentioned. What comes most immediately to mind? Welcome. Immigration. Immigration. Freedom. Anything else? Okay. Anything else? Say that again? A beacon of hope. Okay. Anything else?
Justice for all.
Justice for all. Okay. Yeah.
Huddled masses.
Huddled masses, right, from the Emil Lazarus poem, The New Colossus. Okay, so we're all on a similar theme. Welcome, immigration, huddled masses, justice, human rights. And there's no question that that's one of the most important meanings that the Statue of Liberty has. But what I want to say tonight is that the Statue of Liberty has had those meanings and a lot of other ones too. And one of the things that I think makes the Statue of Liberty such a significant symbol is that its meaning has changed. It hasn't always been the same. And in fact, the meaning that most of us associate with it, that is, welcome to immigrants from abroad, that's actually a relatively new meaning for the Statue of Liberty. And so one of the reasons for its prominence as a symbol of America is that it has meant a number of different things at different times, and sometimes has even meant contradictory things all at the same time. In addition to all these things, the Statue of Liberty has played a potent role in popular culture, advertising, cinema, and also as a powerful political symbol all over the spectrum, right, center, and left. And finally, not only is the Statue of Liberty a great American symbol, but it's a powerful international symbol as well, as you can see from this image in Tiananmen Square in 1989. This goddess of liberty, made by the Chinese students out of paper mache, was modeled after a postcard of a Statue of Liberty that one of the students who was involved in these demonstrations had found when he spent some time in the United States and went back to China. So this is an explicit reference to the Statue of Liberty. And so an American symbol, an international symbol, and as you'll see, it's a symbol that's had a lot of different meanings as we've gone through time. Now, to understand the full significance of the Statue of Liberty, we need to go back. It's sort of an occupational disease of a historian to want to go back in time. And so we're going to go back to the 1860s to France, where the Statue of Liberty was conceived. In June of 1865, a small group of French liberals, prominent men, they got together at the summer home of this man, Edward de Laboulaye, who was France's reigning expert on the United States. Tocqueville had died a few years earlier. He died in 1859. And Laboulaye was a professor at the Collège de France, which was the most prestigious, still is the most prestigious institution of higher learning, an expert on the United States. And he was an abolitionist who revered Abraham Lincoln. And the ostensible reason for the get-together in June of 1865 was to celebrate the victory of the North in the Civil War and to mourn the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And so these guys were sitting around drinking brandy and smoking cigars, and they were talking about how they could commemorate the president, the assassinated president, and also they wanted to think about giving a gift to the United States that would mark the 100th anniversary in 1876 of American liberty. This group, in addition to Laboulaye, who led it, and included a brother, one of Tocqueville's brothers, and included a grandson of Lafayette, and the up-and-coming sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi. They all had been ardent abolitionists, admirers of the United States, especially in the wake of the victory of the North and the abolition of slavery. And so one of the things that this group was thinking about as they decided how they might commemorate the 100th anniversary of American liberty is at the same time to mark the profound importance of the abolition of slavery. And so keep this in mind, because one of the original meanings of the Statue of Liberty is as a symbol marking the end of slavery in the United States. Now, this group had a bunch of other objectives too. One of them was to get France back into the good graces of the United States, because the French ruler at the time, Napoleon III, who was a nephew of the great Napoleon, he'd supported the South during the Civil War. And so the idea was that they would do something to bring France, excuse me, and the United States back together. There was another objective, this one more discreet, and that was to use the idea of American liberty to obliquely criticize the French political system, which was anything but free. Napoleon III was a dictator, an emperor who had abolished French democracy that had been established in 1848. This group opposed him really starkly. And so by thinking of how you would commemorate American liberty, you would also at the same time show your opposition carefully, because you weren't free in France in the 1860s. You would show your opposition carefully to the regime of Napoleon III. But you would do it in a way that Napoleon III would not fail to notice, because these were all prominent guys. And so, as you can imagine then, Napoleon III was not wild about the idea of giving a gift to America to symbolize American liberty. And for that reason, then, it's not quite right to say that the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France to the United States. Neither government was involved. Not the French government, because Napoleon III didn't like the idea of commemorating liberty, and not the American government, because the American government didn't want to spend any money on the Statue of Liberty. And so the accurate thing to say would be that the Statue of Liberty was a gift from the French people to the American people. The French people to the American people. No government money was involved, no government support was involved. Now, on that same evening, legend has it that this group, led by Laboulaye and Bartholdi, cooked up the idea of creating a Statue of Liberty. Well, it turns out that that legend is just that, a legend. What happened really is that the group turned to Bartholdi, who was the only artist among them, and they said, we want you to think about what would be an appropriate gift for the United States. What would it be? We don't have any idea what it would be. Bartholdi was a sculptor, so it would be a sculpture, but what kind of sculpture would it be? That was for Bartholdi to figure out, and as it turned out, it would take 5 years for this group of French men, led by the sculptor Bartholdi, to figure out that the gift to America would be what we now know as the Statue of Liberty. And so, how did Bartholdi come up with this idea? Well, thinking about liberty, what came to his mind? What came to his mind was the goddesses of liberty that emerged in the ancient world, in the ancient Roman Republic, in Greece, and then more recently in the French Revolution. Symbols of liberty that were represented by a woman. This painting you all know, Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People, was probably the most celebrated image of liberty in the first half of the 19th century. But Bartholdi knew about this image, but he didn't like it. He didn't like it because of the violence represented in this image. You see in the foreground dead bodies. Here you see a young man with a gun. Here's another man with a rifle. Here's a guy with a sword. And Liberty herself looks pretty intense, pretty powerful. And she's dressed in the garb of a working woman. And you can see that she's only partially dressed. And that partial dress was also a symbol of a kind of eroticized radicalism. So Bartholdi didn't like this image. He liked this one a lot better. You can see the difference, right? In this image by the French artist, not a very well-known one, Jeannette Lang, from 1848, Liberty is seated. She's not in motion. She's not leading a crowd. There's no weapons. There are no dead bodies. And she is holding the torch of enlightenment. What liberty for Bartholdi and the French liberals was all about was not about revolution. It was about enlightenment. It was about learning. So these were the images that came to mind when Bartholdi started to think about what would this gift look like. Now, he was a sculptor. He was a guy of some ambition. And so he wasn't thinking about a small project. He was thinking about something large, something colossal. And even though these folks didn't like the regime of Napoleon III, here's another one that Bartholdi was looking at, and here you can see pretty obviously what some of the iconographic antecedents of the Statue of Liberty are. The crown with spokes, the crown with spokes up here, and the Greco-Roman garb. And he was thinking in colossal terms, in Napoleonic terms, and this is what came to mind, the Arc de Triomphe, which was started while Napoleon was still emperor, but not finished until the 1840s. And so this was a powerful, potent symbol of grandeur. And Bartholdi, since he was focused on the ancient world, he was thinking about the goddesses of liberty that emerged from the ancient world, he was also thinking about the colossal statues and other artistic forms from that ancient world. And this is one that he knew really well, the Colossus of Rhodes. And so again, you can see the iconographic antecedents. Of course, the Colossus of Rhodes is a male figure, not a female figure, but there is a torch, there is a crown with spokes, and the Colossus of Rhodes is standing astride the opening to the sea opening to a great city. The boats are going between his legs, not next to him, around him, as would be the case with the Statue of Liberty, but you can see the connections here. So this is one of the earliest renderings in drawing of the Statue of Liberty and the Colossus of Rhodes. So you can see the kinds of artistic images that are in the mind of this young sculptor as he begins to think about what he's going to create. And here's one that maybe is the most important of all, and this is the Colossi from ancient Egypt, first constructed 3,000 years before the Christian era. And Bartholdi went and he visited these colossi from Thebes in 1856. And he was just absolutely struck by them. He photographed them. And here's what he wrote when he saw them. He said, "We are filled with profound emotion in the presence of these colossal witnesses, centuries old, of a past that to us is almost infinite. These granite beings, in their imperturbable majesty, seem to be fixed upon an unlimited future." So having witnessed these, photographed them, written about them, traveled up the Nile River, Bartholdi's first idea was to build something in Egypt. And this is what his first idea was for a goddess, a female statue, a lighthouse statue, a statue that would be in the water. His idea was to do what his ancient ancestors had done, and that is to build a colossus in the ancient world. And right around then, we're talking 1867, this is around the time that the Suez Canal is being built to be opened. Shortly after that, it was, as you know, built by another Frenchman, de Lesseps, and the ruler of Egypt, the Khedive Ismail, wanted a statue to stand at the southern opening of the Suez Canal, and it would symbolize the meeting of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Ishmael was a westernizing leader, and this is the symbolism that he wanted to come up with. And so the first incarnation of Bartholdi's thinking about a colossal statue that would come from the ancient world, this is what he wanted to do with it in the first place. Now, here you can see a clay model, a little bit closer image of it, and there are a number of things interesting about it. So here's a torch. It's in the opposite hand from the one that the Statue of Liberty would hold. The garb is not really Greco-Roman, but it looks kind of like the clothing that an Arab peasant woman would have worn at the time, but the headdress is Cleopatra-like. It takes you back to the ancient world. And so this is why some recent commentators have sort of said, well, you know, the Statue of Liberty was originally a Muslim woman. How ironic that we are living in a society that is banning the immigration of Muslims. And there would be a certain poetic justice, I guess, if this were true, but it's not. Bartholdi wasn't, he was a wholly secular man, a Mason. He wasn't thinking in religious terms. Europeans then did not think about the Islamic world the way we do now. And he wasn't thinking that this was any kind of religious symbol. This was basically a symbol of ancient Egypt that would be dressed appropriately for where it would go. Now, you know, unfortunately, or maybe probably fortunately for us, at least for those of us who love the Statue of Liberty, this project fell apart. Ishmael did not have the money to pay to build it. He was in hock to French and British banks that had essentially taken over his country, and he had to finally tell Bartholdi in 1869 that it was no dice. He didn't have the money to build the thing. And so in the beginning of 1870, Bartholdi went back to France with some sketches in his portfolio, with the idea still in the back of his mind that he needed to think about a gift for the United States. And he was already beginning to think, okay, I'm on the right track. This is a project that could work with some modifications in the United States. He landed in France right as the Franco-Prussian War. Prussia, of course, the antecedent to the modern German Empire. Franco-Prussian War between France and Prussia broke out in the summer of 1870, and it turns out that Bartholdi's hometown was Colmar in Alsace. He was Alsatian, and that town, that city, was taken over by the Germans in August of 1870, and his own home literally was requisitioned by the Germans. As a patriotic Frenchman, there was no way he was going to stay on German territory. And so he went to Paris, his adopted city, and he landed in Paris only to find that city erupting in yet another revolution, the Paris Commune, a radical revolution in which the city of Paris was taken over by rebellious working people, and it actually seceded briefly from the rest of France from March to May of 1871. And Bartholdi didn't identify with this at all. He was a moderate. He was not a revolutionary. He believed in orderly liberty, not revolutionary liberty. And so he was a guy with no place to be. His home, Colomar, had been occupied by the Germans. His city, Paris, was now in the hands of revolutionaries. And so at this point, he decided to go to the United States. He was going to actually go there to figure out what his gift was going to look like. And so toward the end of the summer of 1871, he boarded ship. We think that he had a couple of models with him. And so we think already in 1870, he was getting close to what would come to be the Statue of Liberty. He was totally disillusioned with his own country. As he was about to get on the boat to New York, he wrote to Laboulaye, quoting Bartholdi, "I'll try to glorify the Republic and liberty over there," meaning the United States, "while waiting for them to be restored one day in our own country, if ever that can happen." Some scholars think that Bartholdi intended to emigrate to the United States. I don't think that's true, but he certainly was disillusioned with his own country. So he shows up in the early fall in New York. He speaks no English. He knows nobody, but he has the idea, a pretty well-conceived idea from these models that you just saw, that he wants to build a huge, colossal goddess of liberty, and he wants to plant it in New York. And so he goes around and he scouts out different locations. He goes to Central Park. He's not wild about that. He thinks about, well, maybe if we put it in the Battery, the southern tip of Manhattan, that would work. And he decides, no, it's going to be overshadowed by buildings and things. And this is a little faint. Sorry about that. But this is New York Harbor. This is the place where Bartholdi decided that the Statue of Liberty had to be, then called Bedloe's Island. Now, of course, it's Liberty Island. And what Bartholdi liked about it was that it would be in the water, just like his Egyptian statue would be. It would not be overshadowed by any buildings. And every ship coming into New York would have to go right up next to the Statue of Liberty. And virtually any testimony you have from an immigrant who came in by ship in the late 19th and early 20th centuries say that you could almost touch the Statue of Liberty from the deck of the ship. And so he decided this is where it has to be. The problem is he had no support in the United States. The Americans didn't do things like build colossal statues, abstract things like goddesses of liberty. We were still a young country. We didn't spend money on public buildings and public monuments, and when we did, it was going to be to recognize the great leaders. So the Washington Monument is the kind of thing that we built. The idea of a goddess of liberty that in the abstract would represent liberty, that's not something the Americans would do. And so Bartholdi struck out. He talked to different people. He did, even though he didn't speak English, he had some connections. There was a French community in New York whose members could translate for him. He even had a meeting with President Grant, and nobody liked this idea at all. They was kind of bewildered by it. So you want to give us a gift? You want to decide what it looks like? You want to decide where it's going to go? You're not asking any of us whether we want it or not. You just want to give it to us? And, you know, there's a downside to gift giving, because if you're the recipient of a gift, then you kind of think you owe something in return. And so there was a lot of suspicion of Bartholdi. And there was only one guy, I'll show his picture in a minute, who had any interest in this. We know an awful lot about what Bartholdi was thinking and doing during this period, and we're talking 1871, because he wrote to his mother basically every day. Those letters have been preserved in the New York Public Library. I read the originals. It's really kind of fun to see them. And here is his mother, Charlotte. And until recently, most scholars have thought that her face is the face of the Statue of Liberty. It turns out most likely not to be true. And there's some circumstantial evidence and there's some pretty hard evidence. The circumstantial evidence is that he was such a mama's boy that if he was going to model his great statue after his mother, he would have mentioned it to her in his letters, and he never did. The more definitive evidence comes from a recent book by a young French-American woman named Nathalie Salmon, who started looking back at her ancestors, and she found this woman, Sarah Koblenzer, who was a great-great-great-aunt of hers, a friend of Bartholdi's, someone who modeled in his studio all the time. And I'm relatively convinced by this, that this is the face of the Statue of Liberty. Now, this is the only guy who Bartholdi gets anywhere with when he's in the United States trying to sell the idea of the Statue of Liberty. His name is John W. Forney. He was the president of the elite Union League Club in Philadelphia, and more important, he was the head of the Fairmount Park Commission. The Fairmount Park is the place where the centennial of the American Revolution would take place in 1876. And so Bartholdi has made one important connection, no one in New York, but with someone in Philadelphia. So he goes back to France. He's got his model of what the Statue of Liberty is going to look like, and he starts to try to raise money by selling drawings, by building little plaster models of the Statue of Liberty, and he catches hold of the imagination of artists and journalists. This is the beginning of the great age of the illustrated weekly magazine. And so engravers, illustrators are looking for things to represent, and they seized on the conception of the Statue of Liberty. And so here is an image that appeared in a French illustrated weekly, Le Monde Illustré, the Illustrated World, kind of like the French Life magazine or the French Illustrated London News, and you get this image on the cover. People in France become familiar with the Statue of Liberty even before a single bit of copper goes up, even before any of it comes together. And this allows the popularity of the kind of imagination as portrayed in the illustrated press. This is what makes it possible for Bartholdi to raise the money that allows him to build the Statue of Liberty. And this is the first part he comes up with, the torch and arm, which he ships over to Philadelphia to be displayed in Fairmount Park for the centennial celebration of the American Revolution. It becomes the most popular single exhibit in the entire affair. It's the most photographed, the most visited. You can see, you can climb to the top. Everybody was wild about this. There are letters about this. Journalists are writing about it like crazy. And after this is up in Philadelphia for a few weeks, the New Yorkers start to get a little jealous, thinking, okay, well, do we really, there's something to this Statue of Liberty thing. And so the New Yorkers prevail on Bartholdi to move the thing to New York, where it's displayed in Madison Square, right in the center of things, in 1877. So things are happening. Things are coming together. Bartholdi goes back to France, having been successful in the United States. And in fact, after this, the torch and arm are up in Madison Square, there's a bill before Congress to dedicate Bedloe's Island as the place where the Statue of Liberty is going to stand. There was an old military fort there, and Congress passed a piece of legislation saying, we give Bartholdi this little island to build his statue. What Congress didn't do was to pass an appropriation to help pay for any part of this. There was a $100,000 appropriation, and that was voted down by the American Congress. So yeah, you can have this island we're not using for anything else, but we're not going to give you any money to do this. Didn't matter. Bartholdi was, by this point, pretty good at raising money, and so he put together enough money to start building the head. And so just to get an idea of the scale, you see the size of the human beings who are building the head of the Statue of Liberty relative to the whole thing. And when the head was done, it was displayed at the International Exposition in Paris in 1878, the World's Fair, and it caught on. The Parisians loved it. Europeans came from all over the continent to see it. Journalists wrote about it, and here's what one journalist said as he was watching the head being carted from one place to the other. He said, "Suddenly, at about 8 o'clock in the evening, a colossal head was discerned through the vault of the Arc de Triomphe. It was at once a strange and moving sight to see that at each turn of the wheels, the head swayed slightly, as though acknowledging the cheers of the inquisitive crowds. In spite of ourselves, we tipped our hats to return the courtesy." So you see the beginning of a personalization, a humanization of the Statue of Liberty. And as you'll see in a couple of minutes, this would be a theme, that people begin to see the Statue of Liberty as something that is real and alive. And so you could visit it. People loved it. Here is this same illustrated French weekly showing people going up in the head. Rudyard Kipling, as a young boy, went and visited that, and he wrote that it was the most amazing experience of his young life to look at the world through the eyes of liberty herself. And when the World's Fair was finally over, you had drawings like this. The Statue of Liberty upset, crying, in tears because she's no longer going to be able to be in public interacting with the French people. And the head, like the torch and the arm, are moved into this massive workshop on the outskirts of Paris where the rest of the Statue of Liberty was being built. Now, really luckily for us, Bartholdi decided to elaborately photograph the building of the Statue of Liberty. And so here you can see, I don't have time to go into detail about the construction. If you're interested in that, we can talk about it during the question and answer session, but you can see that there's a wood mold, a plaster on top of that, lead on top of the plaster before you finally get to the copper skin. And again, you can see the scale of the Statue of Liberty relative to the human beings. And it starts to go up. Starts to go up in 1880. This is the central pylon made of wrought iron, and as scaffolding surrounding the thing, it's going up, and here it is towering over the squat rooftops of Paris. There were no tall buildings in Paris in 1880. The tallest buildings were 7 stories high. And so the Statue of Liberty, monumental, towered over the Parisian landscape, and the Parisians loved it. A lot of the most famous people in the country went and visited. The President of the Republic, the great poet Victor Hugo. The last thing Victor Hugo ever wrote was a description of his visit to the Statue of Liberty in Paris. I just want to make a couple. Here's a painting of the statue going up. You can see this painting in one of the top historical museums in Paris. I just want to say one thing about the way it's constructed. The innards of the Statue of Liberty, the skeleton, were built by none other than Gustave Eiffel. In a lot of ways, there is an Eiffel Tower inside. If you open up the Statue of Liberty, you see this structure, which is a dress rehearsal for this structure. It's made out of the same wrought iron, trussed wrought iron that is TRUSSED, with holes there so that the wind can blow through and the structure can sway with the wind. And this is the way he built the Statue of Liberty. And what the Statue of Liberty is, it's been, in the 1980s, it was restored, so it's not wrought iron anymore because it was all rusting out. But it is a thin layer of copper hammered to a width of about 2 pennies that is suspended by springs on this inner metal structure. And this is what the Statue of Liberty, it was a marvel of engineering for the late 19th century. It can float in the wind. It can withstand the high gale winds of New York Harbor because of the brilliance of Gustav Eiffel, which he modeled after the bridges, the great bridges that he built in various European places in the late 19th century. So the Statue of Liberty is really the Eiffel Tower avant la lettre. We got it first in a lot of ways. It's just hidden inside the Statue of Liberty. Now, Statue of Liberty is done. It's standing in Paris. It stood in Paris for over 2 years, and meanwhile, the Americans are supposed to build the pedestal. There was a huge problem. The American committee in charge of building the pedestal couldn't raise any money. They were stuck. There was no money coming in, and so they tried a number of things. One of the things they tried was to put on an art exhibit where artists, painters, writers would contribute a work, and you would sell the work, and that would provide some money. One of those works was Emma Lazarus' great poem that we've already mentioned, The New Colossus. She wrote that as a commission for the art exhibit whose purpose was to raise money to build the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. She had been working with Jews who had come over from Europe fleeing pogroms, and she was from an old Jewish family that had lived in New York City for a couple of centuries, and she was just incredibly upset by what had happened to this group of people and how they weren't doing so well once they got to the United States. And so she wrote this poem that we all know about the welcome that the United States would give to the huddled masses. Unfortunately, this poem did not take hold as Emma Lazarus first wrote it in 1883. Nobody was interested in it. Nobody yet saw the Statue of Liberty as having anything to do with immigration. Nobody read this poem, and in fact, it wasn't engraved on a plaque and attached to the Statue of Liberty until early in the 20th century. And so it didn't quite work. The Americans were having trouble coming up with the money for the pedestal. And so you start to get cartoons like this. Here is the poor Statue of Liberty freezing in the water because she has no pedestal to stand on. Here is Life magazine portraying the poor statue as growing old, so old while she's waiting for the Americans to come through with her pedestal. And finally, she gives up. She can stand no longer. She doesn't have the arm strength to hold the torch up anymore. And at this point, and we're in 1885, the newspaper publisher Joseph Pulitzer comes to the rescue. He puts out a newspaper called the New York World. It's a paper that's oriented toward the regular person. It's not an elite paper like the New York Times. And Pulitzer runs this populist campaign. And what he says is the rich people of New York City aren't willing to put up the money for the pedestal, and that's because they don't really believe in liberty. If they did, they would. And so you, the regular, ordinary people, you're the ones who should raise the money to pay for the pedestal and the Statue of Liberty. And he said to his readers, send in your nickels, dimes, and quarters, and that's exactly what happened. Little bits of money came pouring in envelopes. And Pulitzer said that he would print the name in the paper of everybody who contributed, no matter how small. And so it was a big deal to have your name in the paper. And if you wrote a letter with your contribution, he promised to publish that too. Now, we think that most of those letters Pulitzer wrote himself, but they make kind of fun reading anyway, and he pulled it off. He raised over $100,000, all of it in nickels, dimes, and quarters, and that put the fundraising campaign over the top. Here's a picture of Pulitzer. It put the fundraising campaign over the top, and it was possible then to build the pedestal designed by the great American architect Richard Morris Hunt, who, by the way, had been trained in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. And so now, finally, the Statue of Liberty could be unpacked. It sat on Bedloe's Island for almost a year in 212 shipping crates while they were waiting for the pedestal to be built. Bartholdi thought, we've got to get this over to the United States. And finally, it could be unpacked and put up. And you see a number of pictures, drawings of the Statue of Liberty going up. And one thing that you'll notice is there's no scaffolding. There's too much wind in New York Harbor for there to be scaffolding. The scaffolding would have damaged the copper skin of the Statue of Liberty. And so the only way you could work on it was a system of pulleys. It was like the kinds of things that window washers on skyscrapers have. And so it was a really dangerous job to put together the Statue of Liberty, which is basically thin sheets of copper that are riveted together and then attached to these springs, which then are attached to the central wrought iron columns of the Statue of Liberty. Journalists were fascinated by the headless Statue of Liberty. And finally, in 1886, the Statue of Liberty is complete. There's a huge celebration. All French dignitaries are there. President Cleveland is there to give the major speech. It happens in October 1886, but there are a number of Americans who are not at all happy about this. There are a group of feminists, a group of suffrage advocates for women who charter a boat, sail out to the Statue of Liberty. There was, I think, one woman who was invited to the ceremony. And they get on a bullhorn and they say, what kind of country is it that represents liberty as a woman and doesn't give women the right to vote? At the same time, there were a number of African Americans who were also upset. They were upset for a number of reasons. They were upset partly because the original abolitionist meaning of the Statue of Liberty had been lost. It's hard to see in this picture, but this is a broken chain that one of the early models of the Statue of Liberty had, and a broken chain represents the end of slavery. In the early 1870s, that broken chain was replaced by a tablet of the laws. The tablet reads, as you know, July 4th, 1776. And so the symbolism of abolition is almost entirely gone, except there is a broken chain at the feet of the Statue of Liberty. It's a little hard to see, but if you look close up, it's still there. So the symbol of the abolition of slavery is not altogether gone, but it's not very prominent. And here's what the editorialist of one of the leading African-American newspapers, the Cleveland Gazette, this is what he wrote after witnessing the ceremony of the unveiling of the Statue of Liberty. He said, quote, "Shove the Bartholdi statue, torch and all, into the ocean until the liberty of this country is such as to make it possible for an industrious and inoffensive colored man in the South to earn a respectable living for himself and family without being murdered, his daughter and wife outraged, his property destroyed." The 1880s, a terrible time for African Americans in this country. This is when Jim Crow was established in the South, and there were an average of 2 lynchings of black men every week in this country in the 1880s and 1890s. And so from the point of view of certain African American leaders, the Statue of Liberty was just one big symbol of hypocrisy, a symbol of the United States not living up to its ideals. And something similar was true of feminist leaders who didn't like at all the symbolism of the Statue of Liberty. Now, turning to immigration. This is something that I was completely surprised about when I was doing the research for this book. As you know, beginning in the 1880s, millions of Europeans, mostly from Eastern and Southern Europe, began pouring into the United States. This wave of immigration was enormously controversial. And by the end of the 1880s, the federal government decided that there needed to be an institution to which immigrants could come for, as they put it then, processing, what would eventually become Ellis Island, except the first idea was to place the Immigration Processing Center on the same island as the Statue of Liberty, to put it right at her feet. And this was not at all popular. You can't see the caption, but the Statue of Liberty is fleeing because she's upset about all the riffraff that are going to be dumped at her feet. Here is a prominent illustrated weekly, a kind of satirical weekly magazine judge from the period, and what this is labeled as a European garbage ship, dumping the refuge of Europe at the feet of the Statue of Liberty, who is kind of shivering and hiking up her skirts because she's so upset by being sullied. And here is yet another image from the same period. This is 1892, the Evening Telegram, the dregs of Europe. These are not subtle, obviously, these images. Here's the Statue of Liberty holding her nose at the unwashed that are being dumped at her feet, and she's holding a bottle of carbolic acid, which was the most potent disinfectant known at the time. And lots and lots of images like this. Here's a cartoon saying, okay, well, the Statue of Liberty is just going to become like a rooming house for immigrants. And it's going to get so bad that the immigrants are going to destroy the Statue of Liberty. And who is going to be behind the destruction? The wealthy Wall Street banker who is going to exploit the cheap labor coming in, and Boss Platt of Tammany Hall, who's going to do the same thing. And so what became clear as I was doing the research for this book is that the Statue of Liberty was a symbol of the opposition to immigration before she was a symbol of welcome for people in need coming from abroad. One of the most extraordinary pieces showing this from the time comes written in 1892 by one of the most prominent poets in the United States, Thomas Bailey Aldrich, who was the editor of the Atlantic magazine. And he wrote a verse that he characterized to a friend, and I'm quoting Aldrich, as a protest against America becoming a cesspool of Europe. He entitled his poem, Unguarded Gates, and it features the Statue of Liberty as the guardian of American purity. The poem condemns, as you can see, the wild motley throng pouring in, those bringing with them unknown gods and rights, those tiger passions here to stretch their claws. Then turning to the monument itself, the poet asks, "O liberty, white goddess, is it well to leave the gates unguarded?" Is it well, that is, for the Statue of Liberty to let in all those Italians, Greeks, Jews, Poles, all those strangers, quoting the poem again, with accents of menace alien to our air, voices that once the Tower of Babel knew. And so in the 1890s, it wasn't Emma Lazarus' poem that stood for the Statue of Liberty. It was Thomas Bailey Aldrich's poem, Unguarded Gates. Now, of course, it wouldn't stay this way. The immigration, the symbolism of the Statue of Liberty as favorable to immigration would begin to churn. In the second decade of the 20th century, you can see it in O. Henry's great short story, The Lady Higher Up, where O. Henry has the Statue of Liberty speaking in Irish immigrant brogue. And you can especially see it in the late 1920s and early 1930s, because immigration now is essentially over. In 1922, Congress passed the National Origins Act, which forbid all immigration from Asia and reduced the number of immigrants through a quota system from Eastern and Southern Europe to a minuscule trickle. And with immigration ended, no longer then was it so threatening. And what a series of American governments started to do, but especially the New Deal governments of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, they decided that they would do whatever they could to foster the integration of the immigrants who had come in, especially now that there weren't more people threatening those who were already here. And so President Roosevelt made a point of talking about the United States, especially as it was facing the trauma of the Great Depression, as a diverse country, a country that drew its strength from the variety of people who came in. And so it really is only, and not until the Roosevelt administration, that the Statue of Liberty definitively becomes the symbol of welcome to people, oppressed people coming from abroad. Now, this still, it had a downside because there were a lot of people who wanted to come in the 1930s, people fleeing Nazi Germany and other authoritarian regimes, and for the most part, the United States didn't let them in. Roosevelt's political decision was to emphasize the people who are here, talk about them as constituting a great diverse America, but not to bring new people in. So we now, in the 1930s, have the Statue of Liberty representing the welcome to the huddled masses coming in. It also, and I'll just skip over that one. And here's an image from Life magazine on the eve of the war, and with the rise of Nazism, the symbolism of the Statue of Liberty returns to its origins as being about liberty. The United States standing as a beacon of liberty in the world that is now increasingly under the thumb of authoritarian rulers, whether in Europe or Japan or the Soviet Union. So by the Second World War, the Statue of Liberty now has two definitive meanings. These are the meanings that we associate with it nowadays: a welcome to people from abroad and the United States standing tall in the world as a symbol of liberty. Now, this is all the serious stuff. But there's a lot of less serious stuff that the Statue of Liberty came to represent, and one of them is advertising. After you go home tonight, you will start to see the Statue of Liberty on advertisements everywhere. There's nothing that's more common as a backdrop for advertising than the Statue of Liberty. It started out for the advertising of French products, and then cigarettes. And so here is the L&M cigarettes. Well, you know, the Statue of Liberty is still beautiful after all these years. You can still be beautiful too. I don't know what the connection between the Statue of Liberty and a cigarette is, but it was made nonetheless. And here's a more recent one from Budweiser beer everywhere. And so, needless to say, satirists would start to make fun of the commercialization of the Statue of Liberty, and so you begin to see things like this. Right? The Statue of Liberty turned into the Golden Arches. Or a kind of more hostile anti-American statue. Now it's a bottle of Coke representing not liberty, and you can't see it here, but on that tablet is not July 4th, 1776, but a big dollar sign. The Statue of Liberty represents the almighty dollar. Statue of Liberty, so it's everywhere in advertising. It's also important in popular culture. Who's ever seen the Hitchcock movie Saboteur? Okay, a few people. It's really worth trying to rent. It's an amazing movie, 1942, right in the middle of the war. It's a propaganda movie, brilliantly done. The bad guy, needless to say, is a German saboteur. If you're planning on seeing it, I won't spoil. Needless to say that the key, the denouement takes place in a cardboard Statue of Liberty that Hitchcock built in a soundstage in Los Angeles. And here is the good guy American who's trying to save the bad guy German. The American is such a good guy that he doesn't want the bad guy to come to ill. And I won't tell you what happens after that. But this is a landmark movie, and you all, of course, know the original Planet of the Apes from these stills. And this is the famous scene where Charlton Heston, with his mute female companion, see the broken Statue of Liberty on the beach, and they realize that they've been on Earth all this time. And it's no accident that the filmmaker chose the Statue of Liberty to symbolize the catastrophe that had happened. And that may be one reason why there are a gazillion disaster movies that feature the destruction or the damaging in one way or the other of the Statue of Liberty. And here is The Day After Tomorrow, which is a movie about catastrophic climate change in which New York Harbor freezes over and the Statue of Liberty is frozen almost all the way up to her neck. If you've seen Ghostbuster 2, the Statue of Liberty comes alive and destroys all kinds of things in its wake. And here is one of my favorite of this genre of movies, Escape from New York, where all of Manhattan Island is turned into a giant penal colony. And the irony is that the police who control this penal colony are stationed on Liberty Island. Now, personification. The Statue of Liberty has endlessly been turned into a real woman. I've already mentioned O. Henry has her speaking. And early on, Joseph Pulitzer portrayed her as an ordinary working girl. And for the election, the mayor election in New York City in 1886, Pulitzer interviewed the Statue of Liberty. And he had her endorse his favorite candidate, who was the Tammany Hall candidate, Abraham Hewitt. By the way, this was an election in which Teddy Roosevelt and Henry George were also running for mayor, and they both lost. The Statue of Liberty endorsing the Tammany Hall character. All kinds of other stuff. If you go into the store at the foot of the Statue of Liberty, you can see Statue of Liberty Barbies. Now, since the Statue of Liberty is a woman, all kinds of cartoonists have been fascinated by the idea of transforming this austere mother of the harbor into a sexual being. And you begin to see things like this, or the send-up of the famous painting by Monet, Luncheon on the Grass, right? Instead, you have the Statue of Liberty and the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building, and see the connection there. When airports first started introducing those intrusive scanners where you have to go like this, right? There was a lot of hostility to that. It violated your freedom. It looked underneath your clothes. And so, of course, here is the Statue of Liberty representing your liberty violated. And this was on the cover of the New Republic. And you see things like this during the height of Ms. Magazine and the women's liberation movement. You have the Statue of Liberty tossing away her bra. Now, the Statue of Liberty has been conscripted endlessly for political purposes, right, left, and center, and sometimes in a pretty ugly, unpleasant way. Here, this is kind of good fun. Sarah Palin as the Statue of Liberty, but this image from the Village Voice is less so. Or this one of Obama, against her will, Obamacare violating our liberty. Needless to say, during the past election campaign with the first female presidential candidate, you had lots of stuff about Hillary Clinton. Here, a hostile thing. She, as the Statue of Liberty, is for sale. She, as the Statue of Liberty, telling lies. As you can imagine, the cartoonists have had a field day with Donald Trump, the Statue of Liberty being fired, the Statue of Liberty taking refuge in Canada, the Statue of Liberty being deported back to France. Where do you want her? And you see her bisecting the Eiffel Tower. Cartoonists couldn't resist things like this, and of course, things like that. The Statue of Liberty has just been this all-purpose political symbol, and it's not owned by the left or the right. On both sides, people have used this. Now, one of the things then, just to conclude, that has just, it amazed me all the while I was doing the research and writing of this book, is that for all the ups and downs of the Statue of Liberty, the changes of its meaning, the way it's been degraded and commercialized and used for kind of unpleasant political purposes, the Statue of Liberty has still managed to maintain its dignity. it hasn't been ruined in any way by popular culture. People still take its meaning and its symbolism seriously. This is one reason why it is so omnipresent. I think the reason for the Statue of Liberty's ability to, there are many reasons, but one of the main reasons for the Statue of Liberty's ability to resist its degradation is the timelessness of its classical iconographic form. Another has to do with its magnificent placement in the New York harbor, yet another with its incredible beauty. When you go there and you get close up to it, you can see this color, kind of an otherworldly green from the oxidized copper. And more recently, the Statue of Liberty, I think, has stood for the resilience of New York City and the United States in the face of terror. It stood as a powerful reminder of the value of liberty in our dangerous world. And finally, and maybe most important, is that the Statue of Liberty has maintained its dignity, its importance, its meaning, because it's not just an American symbol, but it's a universal one. The yearning for liberty is an irrepressible worldwide phenomenon, which is why you can see replicas of the Statue of Liberty in 40 different countries. Here's one in Rio. There are 4 in Japan. There's one in Ukraine. There are 2 in China. And recently, there is an African Statue of Liberty erected in the Republic of Congo. And so the Statue of Liberty is as American as apple pie, and at the same time, it's the symbol of something essential to all human life. Thank you.
Well, this is really just an observation that you can comment on as you feel appropriate. It seems to me that more often than not, Americans are erecting statues to war heroes, whereas the Statue of Liberty as an American symbol is speaking to other virtues. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. We're not alone in doing this, but it's true that our most notable monuments tend either to be to great Americans like Mount Rushmore or the Washington Monument, and to heroes of wars, and to have a statue that's a symbol of something abstract is relatively unusual. And in Europe, you have statues that have religious meaning. In this country, because of our religious pluralism, because of the way that the Constitution separates religion and other aspects of popular life, that's been less common, and which may be one reason why the statues that we have represent actual human beings, heroes, rather than something that's abstract. And I think you have your finger on something really important. This may be one of the main reasons why the Statue of Liberty has had such staying power, but because it doesn't overtly stand for anything in particular. We can impose a variety of meanings on it. We can make it mean what we want. And as I tried to suggest, it's meant different things at different times, and it's meant something not just to Americans, but from people around the world. How many of you have visited the Statue of Liberty? And it's great. When you do, you hear lots and lots and lots of other languages. And there are 5 million visitors to the Statue of Liberty, and probably half of them come from foreign countries. And the Statue of Liberty means something to people from around the world. I've interviewed a lot of people who went to the Statue of Liberty. There was a young French woman who was standing in front of the Statue of Liberty, and she was going like this, and she wanted someone to take a picture of her looking like the Statue of Liberty. And so I asked her why she was there and what she was doing that. And she said something like, well, she's always seen pictures of the Statue of Liberty. It was so amazing to be there, and she felt really moved. And she didn't expect to feel moved by being there. So I think what you say is absolutely right.
Is the maintenance of it supported by private
Yeah, private. So this is, didn't have time to get into this, but this is one of the remarkable things about the statue that not that many people know. Essentially, there's no public money that gets spent on the Statue of Liberty. There was a massive restoration done in the 1980s, and the fundraising campaign was brilliantly led by Lee Iacocca, and he raised about $270 million, which was enough both to restore the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. And so there's actually a Statue of Liberty Foundation that's in charge of the restoration. One reason why it had to be restored is that the government unfortunately neglected it for decades. And there was a decent chance that it was going to fall down. I mean, the innards, the wrought iron innards were all rusted out from rainwater and seawater. And that the original Eiffel metal that holds the thing up, that's all been replaced by non-ferrous metal that can't rust. And so it was neglected. Our greatest symbol was in danger of collapsing. And so thanks to Iacocca that we've been able to restore it. There was a downside, and that is that the different companies that contributed to this got to put the Statue of Liberty on their logo. They got to associate their corporate names with the Statue of Liberty, and there was a fair amount of concern at the time about the commercialization of the Statue of Liberty. I'm not too worried about that because it did permit the thing to be restored in a way that I think will last for a long time.
We have another question here.
I'm curious, going back to the original meeting in the mid-1860s, were any of those individuals that first met in that first meeting involved with Bertoldi as he developed his statue later in the 1870s and 1880s?
Only Laboulaye, and not very much. So one of the interesting things is that they basically let Bartholdi off on his own, and they trusted him to come up with something. And we don't know for sure, but it seems really likely that when the Egypt project fell through and it was going to be an American project, Bartholdi showed a couple of the models to Laboulaye, who was very moderate, conservative figure, and he was worried that there could be too much French revolutionary symbolism. And so we think it was Laboulaye's idea to put in Liberty's hand not a broken chain, but a tablet that said July 4th, 1776. But for the most part, Bartholdi was on his own. And so it was really a remarkable achievement of a single-minded man who made this his life's work in a lot of ways.
I think I was in third grade when I visited the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah.
And that's
I was in
when
sixth grade.
That's when I got the last lesson in liberty. And so in the absence of any more serious discussion of what liberty was, the Statue of Liberty said that this is a land where I could do whatever I goddamn please, excuse me. And it's no wonder that we have this statue to bastardize if we don't have a serious understanding of what liberty requires of us, what kinds of institutions we need to build, and I'm sure most of us have on our minds a person who seems to have had the least education about that.
I agree with you, I've often thought that we need to restore civics class, and that kids in high school should read the Constitution. They should read the Declaration of Independence. They should know what this means. They should learn about the struggles that were involved in getting the right to vote, for formerly enslaved people to get the right to vote, for women to get the right to vote, to see what a profoundly important and rare thing it is to have some say, to have consent, the consent of the governed. And so I couldn't agree more. But my optimistic side tells me that this is one reason why the Statue of Liberty is so popular, why we see it everywhere, why advertisers want to use it, even though it kind of vulgarizes and bastardizes it, is that somehow subliminally, for very many of us, the Statue of Liberty really means something. And even though I published this book 4 years ago, I've never remotely had as many interviews and TV things and radio things since the election a year ago, when our at least government attitudes toward immigration seemed to change dramatically. And so there still are an awful lot of people who see one of the great strengths of the United States as being a place that is open to those who have been oppressed elsewhere and who could have a second chance here.
And so what can you tell us about the context surrounding the decision to attach the new Colossus to the statue and that era?
Oh, the context for the Emma Lazarus poem. Yeah, well, it's a great question, and kind of sadly, there isn't much context. And so she wrote this poem, and it was greeted by a deafening silence. It had meaning almost to nobody. And Emma Lazarus was quite a prominent figure in American letters in the 1880s. She died at a very young age. I think she was 37 or 39 or something, unfortunately, but she was a great poet. And she was friends with all the transcendentalists. It was only a couple of them who wrote to her about how moved they were by the poem she had written. And there's a wonderful book by Esther Shore, who teaches at Princeton about Emma Lazarus. And Shore talks about Lazarus's life, very privileged, well-to-do family, and she found herself reading about the immigrants, the Jewish immigrants in particular, who were coming in, who were fleeing for their lives from parts of Russia, and ended up being in holding pens in an island in the East River. And Lazarus, who had really lived in very sort of rarefied circles, went out and worked with these immigrants and was moved by them, and that's why she wrote this poem. She had never thought about the poor before that. She had never thought about immigrants, and the experiences she had over a 2-year period working with this group of immigrants attuned her to the problem, both of what the immigrants were fleeing and the inadequate reception that they were benefiting from in the United States. And so she sat down and wrote this poem. This was not the kind of thing that she wrote. She wrote very esoteric stuff, sort of high literary, transcendental poetry. And this down-to-earth statement, this powerful statement, she was moved to write because of some personal experiences that she had. But it didn't catch hold really until the 1930s, and not as a kind of widespread element of popular culture until 1949, when there was a Broadway musical called Miss Liberty, and the finale is the entire cast singing the new Colossus to words. And it's only then, not until 1949, the middle of the 20th century, that this poem that we all just take for granted becomes known to everybody.
Last question.
You had mentioned that the statue is a symbol of hypocrisy in the late 1800s for women. Sorry. You had mentioned that the statue was a symbol of hypocrisy in the late 1800s, and I was wondering if you thought maybe that negative meaning had returned today, in today's times of a lot of controversy, or maybe if it never faded at all.
It's a great. I'm supposed to stand behind here. It's a great question, and I think one reason why you see the Statue of Liberty being part of the representation of the epidemic of sexual harassment, not that it's new, but that we're now finally talking about it, and it's not an accident that the Statue of Liberty is front and center in the representation of this issue. And so you can certainly say that there has really, for a long time, been something, I guess you could use the word hypocrisy as you did, that the Statue of Liberty is a woman. It's represented by a female figure, but women have not had equal rights. On the other hand, you can see the Statue of Liberty in my optimistic moments, which is most of the time. I like to see the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of what we could be at our best. And I think that's the way an awful lot of people have used it. It's certainly possible and common to use the Statue of Liberty as an emblem of irony. You know, look at how we represent ourselves and look at what we're really like. But I think the more hopeful way to look at it is that nobody lives up to their ideals, but we have some pretty great ideals. The Statue of Liberty stands for them, and we would be doing pretty well if we could live up to what the Statue of Liberty stands for.
Thank you so much.